Thank you. It's, I suppose, really important to recognise that we have DCU, UCC and NUI Maynooth with us today, and I really do thank you for all your submissions in relation to this. You know, it's great, and I suppose some of the areas that we've been talking about is trust, you know. So it's trust in the current Leaving Cert, it's public trust in the Leaving Cert, it's trust in our teachers, it's trust with our students. There's a lot of stakeholders. Trust is a word that we're using a lot. Another word I suppose I'd like to use is fair. Fair, I think, is very important. We had a submission here last week for the committee where they spoke about areas of disadvantage, and where I believe it was 26 to 27% were the number of students that would go on to higher education in disadvantaged areas. So I come from Ballinasloe, East Galway and Roscommon, and we do come from a Pobble deprived area. So that means there's a lot of single parent families, and there's a lot of children that perhaps are not going on to further and higher education for a myriad of different reasons. So is the Leaving Cert fair? I suppose is the question I would ask. And I would have my own very strong opinions on that. The questions I might ask, and then just to pose, if that's all right, just to some of our speakers. Professor O'Leary, delighted to hear that you did that study. Very happy to hear the engagement in terms of teachers. I understand it was a sample of about 750, that you mentioned 30% agreed with being involved in direct assessment, and that they also felt there would be fairer outcomes for their students, and particularly perhaps in DESH schools and so on. I suppose just if you wanted to speak a little bit more about that accurate, consistent and fair decision making in the process. So I might pass that question to you, excuse me, and just maybe some of one or two things that we've learned from the accredited grades that you would point to and say, look, at these are our two learnings maybe from accredited grades. For Mr. Stobart, thank you so much for your contribution. I really was very interested to hear about France, New Zealand and Norway introducing new curricula, and also that you talked about how we have to adapt to a digital future. You talked also about the high numbers taking vocational courses in Norway, and that 80% of marks there are determined by teachers, and also in France. Can I ask you maybe how, say, that country brought that system into place? Because here in Ireland, we're trying to promote the apprenticeship programme and the opportunities for further and higher education. And currently, we would be at a way lower bar, should I say, in terms of apprenticeship. We do have 60 apprenticeship courses at the moment, with another 18 to come on stream. Professor Looney, I might just pose a question to you as well, and great to see that you're a veteran, as you've mentioned. You don't look like a veteran, but a veteran of Leaving Cert reform. And I think it is really important that you've been there at the coalface to sort of see about changes and bringing forward changes, because we can adapt and we can change, we're flexible. Why not take the best of what we've brought with us in a historic way through the Leaving Cert, but also adapt it to make sure that it's a more fair system and that has the trust of everyone around us. I suppose if I might ask you, Professor, just in relation to that, you mentioned about the trade-off. I suppose what I would like you to say to me is, what are your top 3 things that we should be holding close and to our hearts in terms of what we'll be looking at in terms of this Leaving Cert reform? Garmagath. And I might pose the question first, maybe with Professor O'Leary, and then Professor Stobart.
And just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to deal with the fairness issue, and I'm actually just so I don't ramble on. I'm just going to read out something I wrote. The Leaving Cert is fair insofar as everyone takes the same test and under the same conditions. That includes anonymous marking. That's a fact. The public has confidence in the system, and that is important. However, students do not arrive at the testing centres with nothing but ability and a track record of diligent study separating them. Some had better teachers than others, and some were able to avail of the benefits that economic advantage bestows. Example, grinds. Indeed, so many of the problems faced by students in 2020 and 2021 in terms of having access to technology, having a quiet space at home to study, and so on, have been relevant to Leaving Cert fairness long before the arrival of COVID-19.
I think it's very true. Access to grind schools and to private grinds is something that is available to a certain number and cohort of students, and it does skewer, I think, potential opportunities for the students as a whole. So, Gurmila Magath. Professor Stobart, if you'd like to come in.
Yes, thank you. You're hearing me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I think I take it back to the point of us being embedded in a particular system. If we go back to Norway, that it was the teachers who wrested the exam system from the universities back in the 19th century. they wanted to be the centre of assessment, and that tradition has carried through, so they are central. This related element is that of the vocational, and again, I think that's traditional in that the 19th century introduction of exams in England actually came off the professional examinations, and because written subjects, written exams were valued in the high status professions, if you like, the education system took over, and the vocational has always been treated as second fiddle to that. If you can do it, you should do it through the academic route. So how we change that, I think, is an issue of making vocational tracks attractive and recognition in higher education and the like. Ireland has gone a long way with that, with the vocational programme, but the status of that is problematic. So I'm a strong supporter of if we can have apprenticeships, if we can have good destinations for vocational qualifications, I think that's well worthy of support.
Thank you very much, Professor, and very true. I think with our career guidance teachers, I think it's something we can really work on. Professor Looney, if you'd like to come in, I think we have about a minute and a half. Thank you.
Sure. Just to echo my colleague on the issue of fairness, I think Michael's absolutely right when, it has all the trappings of fairness, in terms of what you need around protecting the examination. But the difference between standing in Roscommon and, let's say, and standing in Rathmines or Rathgar, that looks very different to a learner. And it's not just that you enter the examination hall with some economic advantage or social capital or the ability of grinds. It's all the messaging about consequence. And it's all the messaging about consequence that you just don't hear coming into the examination, but that you've heard when you were 10 years old in your family and in your community about what success looks like, what successful learning looks like, and what kinds of learning we value as a society. So I think, yeah, it's a fair examination, but as itself. But I think when you move out, I think it starts to look very different. And it's not just going into the examination hall; it's the messaging that happens earlier. In terms of, you asked me about the trade-offs specifically, Senator, which it's a good question about what kind of balances do we want to have. I think I would certainly, in upper secondary, we have really high retention rates. Our students do stay on to the end. And this is part of our social imaginary. We're really committed to education as a country. And it's probably our downfall in some ways because, we do have taxi drivers and supermarket workers who talk about what poetry came up in the Leaving Cert. It is a national conversation. So we put a high value on education, but in senior cycle, the opportunities for more vocational education, that we could move towards a parity of esteem. So I overhear discussions of parents advising their children not to study certain subjects because it's harder to get a particular mark, or that subject isn't as well regarded. And they're inevitably the arts, the vocational subjects, the subjects that students really enjoy and could engage with. So I think some of those trade-offs we could get a better balance on a better conversation, I think, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Gleeson is wanting to come in, so I'll allow Mr. Gleeson to come in, okay, and we'll conclude then, okay?
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Just to concur with what's been said by Michael and Anne, but to make the point that we have to be realistic about the limitations of examinations. And that when you look, as I've looked in some granular detail at the current system, the content standards have to be inferred in the case of many syllabuses because there's either a lack of objectives or no objectives. These standards are not published, which again, highlights the complexity of this. And I think there are questions underlying the use of attainment referencing, where the fundamental premise is that the issue is with the examination rather than the students. But that ignores other possibilities like the teaching practices in the school. They could be very influential. So it need not necessarily be the examination alone. And then finally, our marking schemes are only published after the event, and they, of course, in turn lead to more teaching to the test next year. So we have to be realistic about the limitations of public examinations as against maybe some aspects of continuous assessment.